Hi, everybody, and welcome to A Case of the Jills. Tonight, I have with me Stephanie Roth Goldberg, and she is a psychotherapist based in New York City. She is going to tell us a little bit about herself. I'm going to let her introduce herself, but she is one of the voices that I usually turn to when I'm writing articles for other publications, including triathlete.com. So I'm really excited to have her here today. Hi, Stephanie.
Hi, thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
I'm happy that you're here.
I always appreciate reading your articles and contributing if that is necessary, but I appreciate the work that you do a lot. I'm a psychotherapist. I specialize in working with athletes, particularly in the eating disorder space. I'm also an eating disorder specialist, and I have been working with both populations for a long time, and the intersection of where that affects people. I do have a practice in New York City, and I myself am a triathlete, although right now I'm mostly running, and I'm a mom, and I'm really passionate about people enjoying sport in a way that is healthy and fulfilling as opposed to stressful and takes away from their life. So I'm excited about this conversation.
Awesome. Good. That's exactly what I'm always trying to aim for. It's one of the things that you and I have talked before when we've collaborated, which is this idea of first and foremost, taking care of the person, and along the way, taking care of the athlete, but person first, right? So
Absolutely.
yeah, that's why I'm excited to talk. So I want to dive right in because in the times that we have connected, we seem to always circle the drain on body image. It just, no matter what we do, it comes up all the time. And so I want to get right into this because I think that for people like you and me who've kind of been in this community for so long, it's hard for us to remember or to sort of see how when people first come to these sports, and when we're typically talking about endurance sports like triathlon, like ultra marathon, like marathoning, people typically come to these sports a little bit later in life, typically. And when they do, they carry with them a tremendous amount of assumptions about what participation is going to mean for them. And additionally, this being sort of timely, that it's January right now, and there's a lot of new year, new you stuff happening out there. And so I just would love for you to tell us, what are some of the pitfalls of carrying those assumptions about what we think that participation in these sports is going to do for us physically, and what the dangers of that would be?
Yeah, I actually think sometimes, as you said, when people come to it later in life, it is one of the motivations to come to these sports is this idea of what it will do to someone physically.
She said it, I didn't. She's a professional. Ask her.
But you make a really good point. They carry with them years of bias about what athletes look like who participate in these sort of endurance sports. And what you need to look like to participate, or and I think what happens a lot of times is people then get a little stuck on that aspect of things, which takes away from the enjoyment of the sport. And oftentimes it takes away from their ability to perform at their best level because they may be following a rigid diet that doesn't provide enough adequate nutrition to do what they need to do, but because they're sort of stuck on looking a certain way, they often don't even investigate whether that's an aspect of why they might be fatigued or, just not performing in a way that they would hope to. And I think a lot of times the other thing is it affects people's ability to rest, even if they can't identify that body image is at the forefront of a resistance to rest. The idea that they might eat differently on a rest day, I think that has a lot to do with body image, or that they will only eat if they train. There's a sort of a crossover there of body image and a relationship to food. But yeah, as you said, I think you and I do always circle back here and
it seems that running and triathlon in particular always seems to produce the stereotypical concept of the very lean triathlete body, the lean runner body. And that seems to be, like you said, a motivation. When you actually have people that end up in your office, how much of this kind of concept of putting the body image with the sport is part and parcel of what they're seeking treatment for?
It often never comes up until we really dive into what's going on, how they got to me. And it's not a concept that many people sort of come with at the forefront. Often people come to me after injuries, and maybe their doctor or dietitian has suggested that they also need a mental health provider who understands being an athlete and being in the sport. And it's through listening and getting to know someone and understanding that relationship they have to food that then we usually get to the body image piece. Sometimes people will come in and recognize that they really struggle with body image and they overtrain and they know it, and it's really difficult to untangle. But I would say that's less common.
Right. So basically what you're talking about here from a clinical perspective is a disconnect between a desire to have a certain body and the actual ability, let's say, even though that's probably the wrong word, but the ability for your body to actually look like that thing that you desire for it to look like. And so in that space between your desire to look like something and your body's actual genetic ability to look like something, there seems to be is that really where the crux of the problem is?
Yes, I think so. And I think also, it's interesting you use the word desirability, because I think people have the idea that they need to look a certain way to be desirable, even in other aspects of their life. And so that's in the mix as well, is that it's not always just related to their sport, because they can maybe understand the science that is there and the need for eating and resting. And then it sort of gets into, but these other aspects of their life that they feel they need to look a certain way for.
People who come to these sports, and let's face it, you don't just casually stumble into triathlon. You don't just casually become an ultramarathoner. So there's people that have decided to sort of explore this area of sport, and they are doing this maybe at a transitional moment in life. Would you say, does that happen?
Definitely that happens. And I think being involved in the sport, I imagine this is your experience too. We meet people like that all the time, right? So, yeah.
And so these people, we come to the sport, we're looking to accomplish a lot of things, right? We're looking for that sport to do a lot of heavy lifting. We want it to give us social life. We want it to give us a beautiful new body. We want it to make us feel accomplished. And in the case of triathlon, we're obviously looking for some place to deposit our hard-earned funds. But what happens when we're asking that sport to do so much heavy lifting?
So one of the things that you and I have discussed before, and one of the main areas where I work with people, is that all of the heavy lifting that we are asking of this sport gets overshadowed by this idea of wanting to look a certain way, or being stuck on needing to eat a certain way in order to look or perform a certain way. We start losing the benefits of the socialization or of the feelings of, well, with running, right? Like that euphoric feeling that you get after a long run, but just the feelings of pride often get overshadowed. And it becomes something that is not good enough, or they're not good enough at. So when we ask so much of one thing, I think it sort of all falls apart because we only recognize the deficit.
When it comes to body image, do you notice that there is an assumption that the more you look like the stereotypical athlete, the better you're going to perform? Or is that just totally lost when you're seeing people?
I think that's a belief that people have in general. And I think we're at a point in sport where people are really coming out and talking about this within the athletic world and trying to dismantle that belief. But it takes a lot of work for people to understand what as you said, their bodies natural genetic makeup, and feeling proud of that body and what that body can do.
When we collaborated on an article a little while ago, something that you said kind of rings in my head all the time. You said something about when you're working with athletes, that one of the most difficult things is challenging their assumptions. And I never really thought of it that way, but it's true that athletes do have very strong assumptions about what they believe makes a good athlete. And can you talk about some of those assumptions that athletes may be holding on to that could be affecting their eating habits and how they view themselves, particularly with the eye to body image?
Yeah, I was actually just having this conversation this week with someone, so I'll give this as an example, that some people assume that you're not really a good runner unless you can run under a 4-hour marathon.
Then I suck. I am a terrible runner. I'm horrible.
But I'm sure you've heard that assumption, right? And so many of us have not accomplished that goal or may never. And I think at the point when we don't want to, that's an excellent place to be if that's not where our natural sort of ability is. But often people then tie that to, oh, I must lose weight in order to get to this goal that will make me a better runner or a real runner. And so we're, again, sort of, we put the weight at the focus, which oftentimes is not necessary at all. It doesn't mean that they're going to automatically be faster because they've lost weight. And a lot of people actually can run any timed marathon in larger bodies than what we typically think of. And people just seem to forget that often.
I have to say that every time I hear about people using the sport to accomplish something, even if it's something like weight loss, or let's say they have a performance goal, like you said, the under 4-hour marathon or whatever. I'm cynical because I've studied psychology for too long, but I feel like that goal is a convenient goal that you can talk to people about at work or at home or even to yourself. But really, there's something else missing that you feel as though this achievement is going to fix or fill.
Right.
Can you talk, if you think that that is the case, or if you have experience with working with people in that way, what does that look like? And how difficult is it for people to figure out what the question is there, what the thing is that they're trying to fix?
I think that's a really good point. I think there are times when that's not always the case, I will say. But there, as you were talking, I was just in my head saying self-worth, right? And I think that's often what people kind of put onto these goals, these sort of, I want to call them arbitrary goals, really. But it's a lot easier to pick something specific and concrete that we believe we have control over and sort of then try and get to where we want to be with that, than to investigate why we don't feel worthy in all of the areas of our life. And so similar to dieting, if we have a plan and, we're going somewhere, it's easy to feel like you're working on something. You've heard me say many times that sport is not therapy. It can be therapeutic, but it's not therapy. And this is sort of the crux of why I always say that, because it can feel like we're working on something. So self-worth, for example, but they're not. It's not being worked on in a real way.
Kind of pushing it aside and doing a task, which is maybe like doing the sport. It ends up being a task that takes the place of actually focusing on what you need to work on, right?
Right.
And I know from personal experience that, sport is a wonderful way to numb out. Right. And so it's like you said, it feels like work. It feels like you're accomplishing something. It also feels in a way that you are connecting with yourself when you're kind of doing anything but, because you're putting yourself mentally, physically in another place. And in my case, I did not have the ability to sit with my emotions. And so when you're working with patients, how do you invite them to sit with their emotions, particularly athletes now, because, you know, athletes don't want to sit for a second, never mind to sit with their emotions. So how do you have that conversation with athletes about feeling feelings, sitting with emotions, and figuring out other ways to offset those painful feelings or uncomfortability?
I think, and I wonder if you agree with this, just from, being someone who studied psychology for as long as you did. I think that people in general are sort of never taught that it's okay to have emotions.
So true. So true. Yeah.
So I think there's sort of almost, we have to go back to a space where we can identify what emotions we even have before we can sit with them. Or at least identify what you're saying, that idea that athletes don't like to sit still. So they may not even know that they're avoiding something by moving because they just like to move. It brings them some kind of enjoyment. So it takes a little investigation into sort of what else is going on in their life. What time do they find that they maybe throw in an extra training session or cross training session that wasn't in their plans, that kind of thing. And then I always say, first and foremost, we have to figure out what we're feeling to be able to sit with it. And then recognize that just because we have a feeling doesn't mean we have to act on it. It doesn't mean it has to go away. Feelings can really be informative of what are we missing? What conversations do we need to have with people in our life? Or what relationships are, not working for us, or jobs or whatever, but we need to sit with them to figure it out. And I think that's a concept that people buy into and understand. So that's one of the things I often talk about, is how do we work through whatever is causing the emotion if we can't sit with it and sort of play with it and think about it.
Yeah, that's an interesting, the way you describe it, play with it. We have no concept of that in our culture, that getting in touch with emotions can be informative, can also be, I don't want to use the word fun, but it's not terrible. And
Right.
you really learn a lot about yourself and your reactions when you're capable to do that. You're so right, though. We are not taught that at all. So some things that people in our community would do when they feel uncomfortable emotions are, as you said, add extra sessions, add slightly longer sessions, sign up for races that they didn't intend to sign up for, not take rest days. My favorite, active rest days, which just generally means an exercise day, but not really,
Right.
But let's talk about some of the sort of, since you are used to speaking with people that have eating disorder in sport, can you talk about some of the ways that people might approach their nutrition when they're feeling emotionally confused or in pain or ignorant to those emotions? What are some of the things that people will do from a dietary perspective, athletes?
Well, another way people avoid their emotions is by restricting food and or binging on food, or purging. And believe it or not, some of the athletes I work with don't identify that doing that extra training session can be a way of purging. And I think, again, labeling things can be really helpful for people to sort of look at themselves differently in their behavior. But I think also the idea of restriction comes in because people focus on something else. Okay, I'm hungry, but I can feel powerful in overcoming this sensation in my body. So if I can't feel powerful by going on that, long bike ride or whatever. And that's not usually a conscious thought. It's just the way that they sort of are moving through their life. And by restricting food, you are sort of avoiding the fear of whatever comes up for that, the body image piece, or, sort of the performance piece. And by binging, often you then create a dialogue of, I shouldn't be eating this. Why am I eating this? This doesn't even, what am I going to do about this? And you've blocked out any feeling about, or any thought about the feelings you were having. That's often where eating comes into play, is that it just becomes a different thing to focus on, and it's avoidant.
And so also there's that kind of concept that like either through the pain of extra exercise or through the pain of being hungry, you are in effect able to focus on that rather than it's somehow easier to focus on the physical pain of those things than it is for the maybe mental pain that you're trying to avoid.
Right. And we're conditioned to just do that. So I don't think that people consciously make those choices. But one of the ways that I think people start to heal from these behaviors and ideas is by making them conscious, is by sort of recognizing, oh, I know I should be eating right now. Why am I choosing to not eat, or what's going on that, and so I think as soon as people can become more conscious, they sort of are forced to look at what's right in front of them.
Right. Interesting. Kind of branching off that a little bit, one of the things about eating disorders in sport is that, I mean, it is like the constant stereotype of the skinny young female who is the typical restrictive eating disorder and, in some type of body conscious sport, whether it's skating or running or dance or, something. And I'm sick to death of that stereotype because it really is reductive. In my research, and I know, you've seen my stuff in my research, the most underdiagnosed segment of the population, and by the way, this is over 500 ultra endurance athletes from the ages of 18 to 72. In that population, the most underdiagnosed was males. Mm-hmm. And they not only did not recognize disordered eating in their own patterns and behaviors, but they had never even considered that they had need for any type of mental health care, whether or not it was related to eating disorder or disordered eating. Can you talk a little bit more about how these things may express themselves in that male population and why it's so important for them to speak to someone?
Yeah, I mean, one thing I want to say though is we're so lucky to have people like you in this sport and in the field now, right? Because people weren't even researching. I think before people could recognize, I think, as you said, they're undiagnosed because people sort of weren't paying attention. So it's great to have. Well, right, exactly. They still don't. But now we have some research and concrete statistics to go to say, no, these are real things. Another thing that's so common in this world of endurance sports is people talking about what did they eat, what fuel do they have. And so it's so normalized in the way that, and people don't talk in the way of like, oh no, I'm not eating, breakfast. It's like, oh, I'm doing a fasted workout, which, right, we know over and over and over that's not a good thing to do for many reasons. But so it's even just the language, I think, that we can listen for. I think that one of the things that men can recognize, along with women, but men, is their performance. And often when someone is restricting or has an eating disorder, at a certain point, their performance does suffer, or they also have injuries. And hopefully people learn about RED-S, and I think that, now is sort of more in the magazines and that kind of thing. But I also think it's coaches that have to pay attention, right, in the ways that you're saying, and make it sort of unacceptable to, do fasted workouts or not, eat, or check in on their athletes. Are you eating within, a certain time of getting home? That kind of thing. With men too. I think even, there's just such a bias, as you said, that people focus on women.
Right.
I had a teammate at one point on a triathlon team several years ago whose wife was having a lot of infertility problems. And eventually the doctor looked at the man, and he had really low testosterone, which is, as we know, a symptom of overtraining and undereating. And he did a lot of, he was really surprised, and he did a lot of talking about it. And I believe he was writing articles at one point. And so I also think it takes the bravery of people who are aware of what this does to talk about it, because we do hear people talking about it in regards to women, but not men. So I think men themselves also have to, be brave enough to talk about it with their teammates, or put it out in the world.
Yeah, I think that there's this kind of assumption in endurance sport that, especially particularly with ultramarathon, just by virtue of the structure of the races, how they're set up with, the big kind of snack tables for when you have an aid station, and it's like a smorgasbord of food, and everyone knows that the only way you get through an ultramarathon, and like I would even argue an Ironman competition, is by eating your way through it. You can't make it through on just whatever glucose you've got stored up. Like, you need to eat all the way through that. And I think that there is a disconnect between that and the type of food that's being laid out at those aid stations, the encouragement for people to eat, the normalization of that conversation, versus eating in a certain way and then training to compensate for the way you ate, planning these big post-run meals or post-run breakfasts, and then running to catch up with that eating. And that for me seems to be how I personally have seen some eating concerns in the male population, particularly in ultramarathon. But what you're describing is a little more on the restrictive side that you see clinically. Would that be accurate? Do you see more of that restrictive stuff clinically, or do you see some of those binge behaviors, or are they just not recognized?
So I think the thing is, I see the restrictive side more clinically. I think the binge behaviors, as you're saying, are sort of encouraged, and they're done. And you're right, particularly, I've never done an ultramarathon, but I know I know people who have, and I understand sort of the snack tables. I've actually heard a lot about those. So yeah, and I think it's so normalized that people are like, oh, okay, this is what's happening. But now we have a term people use, performance eating, right? So you'll eat enough to, like you said, run that next leg or make up for the bike ride you did or whatever. But people don't recognize when you only are eating in that performance way. That's another way of binging. You're only eating this amount, these periods of times. The other thing actually I wanted to say about this, I was recently, I don't know if you've ever listened to the podcast, Some Work, All Play.
No.
It's a great podcast. And recently I was listening to an episode where they were talking about underfueling in men, and how that if men, I get like morning erections is a way that men can tell their testosterone is low. And I thought, this is awesome that they're really just talking about this in a way that I have yet to hear people really talking about. And the podcast is quite funny, but it's relatable. And I think it gives it a language that's so important. And similar in the ultramarathon, community, I think when people begin to recognize that, they will start talking about it.
Yeah, it's interesting. I have, not to plug my own videos here, but I do have a video from about, I want to say maybe 4 years ago, when I talked about overtraining in men, and I talked about erectile dysfunction, and I talked about waking up, and if guys don't have a morning erection, that is a number one sign. And it's not the number one sign because it's the first, it's the number one sign because it's the one that scares the crap out of them. Right. And it is important to know, when women who lose a period, that's like the canary in the coal mine, and you see that first. And so by the time, for example, when I advise athletes, by the time they get to me, the men, by the time they get to me, they are so far down the rabbit hole because they don't have that really, really important warning sign of getting a period.
Right.
A period. So when they're already down to the erectile dysfunction zone, they are really in a lot of pain, and that is unfortunate and unnecessary. And yeah, that's the stuff that really upsets me, is the lack of education, the lack of knowledge about this stuff, lack of communication, and they get scared and they get nervous and they don't know who to turn to. And then,
And I think men in general, I don't know the statistics around this, but I would feel confident saying I'm right, that men in general don't seek mental health in the same way that women do, and they don't get referrals for mental health providers at the same rate that women do.
Yeah, in my research, I did ask the question about who had sought mental health care in the past, and absolutely men were much less than women across the board for every potential mental illness. They had sought and were treated for much less mental illness. So definitely true. And yeah, the boys need language to describe what they're going through, and they need community. Well, we all do, but particularly with the men. And I do hope that that happens at some point in the future. So speaking of kind of this weird balance of, you know, figuring out how much we're training and how much we're eating, I wanted to get your opinion and see if you see more people becoming obsessed with fitness trackers, calorie trackers, Strava data, just the quantified life. And this is kind of a hot button issue for me lately. And I'm just wondering how this is showing up clinically. Where are people getting obsessed? What does that look like? How extreme does it go? Tell us what it looks like from your side.
I find this to be so tricky when it comes to athletes. I think when it comes, I'll just say when it comes to the everyday person, I think I'm generally an advocate for there's no need to track pretty much anything. But with athletes, as we know, there is some need to track things, to have some metrics. So it gets really complicated. And I think Strava is a social platform and people do interact, and it can be fun, but where it does get to be too much is when people sort of, and this is kind of, we've almost circled all the way back to where we started, right? As they focus too much on these external numbers and the external data, that they lose sight of how they're feeling physiologically and emotionally. So they might run through pain because they want to hit this number, this metric, and they want to hit their Strava goal of the week and those kinds of things. So I always think the line is when we can stop taking care of our physical selves, and we find that the thoughts go to those metrics as opposed to other aspects of how our training cycles are going.
Right. And what about the kind of, I'm not even going to say the names of them because I hate them so much, but there's these apps, and everyone who's watching this video right now either has them on their phone. Do not lie to me. I know you do. Or has seen them before, where you will input what you think is an accurate description of the activity that you did that day and the time that you did that activity. And you will input what you think is an accurate description of the food that you ate with the nutritional content of that food, which you believe to be accurate. And then, through the magic of this app, a number is going to spit out to tell you how much you should eat all day. And so you're required to do several things, one of which is to carry that device with you all day and input as you go, or at some point at the end of the day. You're probably going to be weighing your food. You're probably going to be reading nutritional labels. You're probably going to do a lot of things in service of that app. And those are the ones that concern me the most. And that's just my anecdotal view, but clinically, how does that shake out for you?
So clinically, I generally discourage any tracking of food. So I should have actually specified that in the beginning, because I was thinking it's tricky with metrics such as Strava data. I actually don't think it's that tricky when it comes to food. I think that we can, and here's another thing we're not taught, our bodies know what they need. And so if we can connect with our bodies on, I'm hungry, oh, I felt tired on that run, or, in that swim, maybe I need more carbs. I'm not eating enough protein. I think that we can also then start out to treat ourselves better and go to a weight. If I don't encourage weighing oneself, but that is a natural, healthy place to be. And when I think of health, I think of the mental health aspect is not focusing too much on the food, because that distracts from so much of your life. I have a friend and colleague who is a sports dietitian who I really respect. And her and I were talking about this recently, and Lauren Anatucci, and her idea was, a great way to track one's food is to plan it out in the beginning of the day and look at it and say, is this enough? Because we generally know what we need, but that's a better way to think about it, by looking at the food and not inputting it anywhere. And maybe you have an idea, okay, I need 2 carbs per meal at this point in my training cycle. But again, it doesn't have to be measured. I think it really becomes a problem when we rely on those apps to tell us how much to eat, because again, it takes the focus of how we feel in our bodies and how we then take care of ourselves.
That's so interesting, because I totally, every time when I work with people all the time, with the athletes that I mentor, there is a huge discussion about whether or not they can trust their instincts. And it's like, their instincts have been offloaded to these devices forever. We've decided to tell people, and this is one of the assumptions that I'm sure you have to challenge all the time, which is that you are not capable to understand your body's needs, and you must use some external device to help you make those decisions. And particularly for women, just to get on my feminist soapbox for a second, but we've been told forever that we don't know enough about ourselves intuitively, and we should be listening to every other expert there is. And I truly believe that the more we're able to tune back into those voices telling us what we need. I mean, it's not a perfect science, right? I know there's the concept of intuitive eating, and I don't know what your thoughts are on that, but I do think that there's like a voice that will say, yo, we need a bagel, like make this happen. And I think that that's an important voice to listen to. And I do agree with you that most of the time athletes are under eating and they need to figure out if that's enough. By the way, I just want to say for everyone watching this video, that what I just said right there, most athletes under eat, is something that I used to read when I was an athlete and not eating enough. And I used to scoff at that. So if I just said that and you went, like, I know, because I did that too. So trust. So those assumptions like that, that people need to be looking at a device to tell them, where would you say that people can get good information? Let's say if someone just can't think of other creative carbohydrates, or they just don't know where to get good, let's say, inspiration, or even like a recipe or a concept of what is a possible protein. Some people are just not really great about knowing how to source different things. So where would you suggest for people to get that information?
A dietitian.
Right.
And I do think dietitians don't have the same stigma as mental health providers have, and people are willing to see them.
That is very interesting. Wow.
And I think particularly if people believe this will help them achieve their athletic goal, they will do that because it doesn't have the same stigma as going to a therapist. But also sports RDs are really trained to help people eat to accomplish their goal. And any of the sports dietitians that I have worked with in the last few years or ever refer to no longer really focus on weight, because we now know it's really about individual needs. And so I think sometimes when people can hear that from a professional, also they can kind of disconnect a little bit from that being the goal.
So lots of times when I work with people and I remind them, as you said, that therapy is not, running is not therapy. Therapy is therapy. That, a sport can be an adjunct to a good mental health care program, but it is not a substitute for quality mental health. And so obviously, if you are an athlete who's used to running out your fears and emotions and pains and problems, that's going to be what feels really good to you. And you're going to need to get used to something that feels a little bit different at first to manage mental health. And so what are some of those tools that you would be comfortable suggesting to people? I mean, brass tacks, I think that if someone needs mental health care, they need to see a mental health care practitioner. It is not possible for everyone, as we know, particularly now.
Right.
In those cases, where can athletes start to investigate other ways to manage emotions or start to look in to identify those emotions? What are some tools?
So it's interesting because I want to say that so many people turn to Instagram, and I think Instagram can be really helpful, but in itself, it creates I don't know, some whole host of other problems. So sometimes for ideas, if you want to follow sports dietitians, sports therapists, it can be a good idea. But what I encourage the people I work with to do is I say, everyone needs a toolbox. Like you wouldn't hang a picture by getting a wrench, right? And so you're not going to solve your relational conflicts by going on a run, actually, right? You need to sort of think about that. They require conversations. And so I think I encourage people to literally create a toolbox, whether that means they get a, decorative basket and put it near their couch that has some activities they might like to do. And having it out is a reminder that I have this instinct to go, at a training session or whatever, but here's some other things that I have personally decided work. And sometimes I do encourage people to put recovery tools in there, a foam roller or whatever. And then maybe a book, sort of things that they think that will engage them in a different way. So it can be like a book, a puzzle, any of those kinds of like creative things. I often find people do better when they're doing something with their hands. So watching TV is great, but I also think the majority of people sort of now watch TV while also watching their phone, and it's not.
Yeah, not what it used to be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But what I do encourage people is to go, through their house and look for a box or a basket or buy one and start putting Post-its in there of other things that they can do, take a shower, take a bath.
The last question I want to ask you is, I have this concept that I try to impart to people, which is that you don't want to ignore your limits. You want to know what they are so that when you start to see them approaching, you can avoid them instead of smacking your face into them like a brick wall.
I love that. Yes.
Right? So if I am an athlete and I am maybe not at that, brick wall phase, what kind of behaviors, thoughts, things that I might be thinking or doing would suggest to me potentially that I might be headed for trouble from a mental health perspective as an endurance athlete?
My number one answer is usually irritability. And I think people do feel that a lot. And when that extra training session or calling a friend or doing all of those other things doesn't soothe that irritability, that can be a really good sign. And I think it is something people can recognize, like, why am I sort of snapping at everyone I'm talking to or impatient? So I think that's a really important sign because it will play out in every area, or in many areas, I should say. Sleep disturbances are another sign. That's our brain's way and our body's way of trying to tell us something. So if that is coming up, that's worth investigating and noting. Burnout is another one. Although burnout is actually, if you're there, you've smacked your head against the boundary, as you said. So if your mind is really distracted, also in any activity, loss of enjoyment in the activities you're doing is another way that people can identify, I used to like this, or why can't I, and again, it kind of converges with irritability in a way, but and changes in the way that you are thinking about food and or eating, not eating, is another sign.
Right. Okay, cool. I also just want to point out, because we've talked about this before too, you and I have discussed this, but it's important. I think it's worth noting that even the most elite of elite athletes, even the most dedicated athlete, can sit down and eat a meal with their family. And if you find as an athlete that you are not willing or able to sit down with family or friends and share a meal because you have to eat certain things or you're scared of the food on the table, or something about that situation is making you anxious, and this is something you pointed out when we talked before, like this is an area that you need to take a look at, because it is not part of being an athlete that you will avoid being social with food and meal times.
Absolutely. Thank you for bringing that up. That's an excellent point. And it's one of the things that I often say, let's look at where being an athlete takes away from your life, and not eating with your family or friends is something that is being taken away by this idea, as you said, or this belief that you have to eat a certain way or certain things. And so I think that's another thing to investigate. Like, is this adding to my life or is it taking away from my life?
Right. Awesome. Perfect. Yeah. Because, at the end of the day, you're going to be an athlete for a portion of your life, or you're going to be you for your entire life. And so, I think whatever we do on the field or on the road or on the bike or in the pool or whatever sport it is that we're doing, it has to, if it's not enhancing who you are as a person, when you're not doing those things, we got to talk about it. Right.
Right. Absolutely.
Yes. I can't thank you enough. This is a great conversation. I hope that people were able to pull all the little pearls out of here. There were so many. If people want to connect with you, where can they find you? Where's the best place to find you and interact with you?
So my website is, it's a long name, Intuitive Psychotherapy NYC. So on there's a contact page and you can contact me that way. My Instagram is Embodied Psychotherapist, and you can always contact me that way. Those are the best ways, I would say.
Awesome. And she has a really cool new website too that I checked out the other day. It looks really nice.
Oh, thank you. Redo it.
It's awesome. And I will put links in the description box below. And again, thank you so much, Stephanie. Thanks everyone for watching, and we will see you again soon.